Going. All right, we're live. Good morning, everyone. Here with our good friend, Dr. Fred Below, University of Illinois. We're here with our season finale episode of Ask the Agronomist. We got the whole gang here. We got Adam, we got Jennifer. We're going to be giving away our season-ending prize. Been looking forward to getting together with Dr. Below. Really appreciate his willingness to. His time is mucho valuable. And so really appreciate him being here with us again. I know he always gets anxious. He's always afraid he won't do a good enough job. And you all know how awesome Dr. Below is. Every time we do anything with him, we get tons and tons of compliments on how much people enjoy listening to Dr. Below talk. So we're going to cover a wide range of topics. I want to talk with him about his research, what they had going on this summer. We'll talk a lot about the year, about the agronomy, the weather. I mean, a lot of the stuff that we've all talked about already, but like to get Dr. Below's take on it. We'll probably talk with him about some of his research projects. He's working on short corn, working on biological nitrogen, lots of things that are top of mind for growers. And as always, we hope to get your questions. And as questions come into the chat, we will move your question to the top of the order here. So anyway, welcome, Dr. Below. Thank you for being with us, and we'll kick things off with tell us a little bit about how many students you've got in your program currently. You got Dr. Sybil, so you got a kind of a co-doctor in the program these days, which is a little different. But tell us about your team.
Yeah, Lance. Hey, welcome to the audience. Really appreciate it. I like being called an agronomist instead of a physiologist for the day because, physiology is an even more confusing term than agronomy.
I think physiologists get paid more though, so you might hang on to that.
I'll go back to that when the show's over, Lance. So we're on the University of Illinois campus, in case you didn't know, and this is the second to the last day of finals. Remember final exams, and so it's almost done. And that means pretty soon the town's a ghost town here. Actually, that's why we have this conference room available for us today, Lance. But do appreciate the opportunity to visit with you. Happy to answer your questions. I think the audience knows we're interested in high yield corn and soybean research. Anything that we can do to increase yield, and we like to look at the latest and greatest stuff, and obviously that would include short corn. I think that's the next innovation. Biologicals are having a moment, we have to look at those, and we're actually paying a little attention to soybean, Lance. We discovered you can plant soybean earlier than corn, and
right.
There's some big impacts.
Farmers have learned that raising 80-90 bushel soybeans is kind of fun, pretty profitable, and there's a lot more interest in high yield soybeans than there used to be.
Definitely. And Lance, I think you and I, when we were in school, we learned that soybean had a higher base temperature required to germinate than in corn. That the base temperature is the minimum temperature. And I think you and I learned that soybean was 55 and corn was 50. And that would naturally mean plant corn before soybean.
Right.
Okay, turns out that was wrong, Lance.
That's right.
And it turns out that was because we were using bin run seed and we weren't treating it. Now, scientifically, soybean has the same temperature, minimum temperature to emerge than corn. And that means that guess what? You could plant it at the same time or earlier.
We've actually seen a trend here in recent years, and I don't know if you've seen this in your trials or not. I know research trials are not always planted as early as farmers like to plant, and I would say this year for sure, and we've seen this trend in previous years too. The best corn wasn't necessarily what was planted first, and there's always tremendous pressure to get your corn in early. And it's a little frustrating that in a lot of cases, the mid-May corn has been out yielding the mid-April corn. And so I've been trying to get growers to not necessarily wait till May to plant their corn, but I don't think we should be fearful of not finishing planting corn until, the second or third week of May.
Yeah. Lance, we never really looked at early planting soybean because we were so busy worrying about corn.
Right.
And then when we got the corn in the ground, we started worrying about did it emerge evenly. And then we discovered that if we waited A little later,
Mm-hmm.
when the soil conditions were right and we could get that rapid, uniform, even emergence, we actually got a higher yield than when we planted it too early.
Right.
So yeah, I don't have to tell growers that uneven emergence is a nightmare, when it comes to ear count.
Right. Well, and I think as you push yields higher, that stuff becomes more important too, because your population's higher, you got more competition between plants, you're trying to get the most out of every plant, and that uniformity, the National Corn Yield Contest results came out yesterday, and those guys live and die by uniformity of emergence, and talk a lot about how critical that is, and the higher the yield you're trying to achieve, I think the more important that becomes.
I mean, the good news for soybean is it doesn't care as much about uniformity of emergence. It can compensate, and it can make its yield in August. So
Right.
that's kind of a no-brainer, I think, to try and get soybean in ahead of corn if you're itching to plant something. Now, there is a too early.
Right.
But that's been a big factor that we've been looking at.
Well, and one thing I like to remind growers is I don't necessarily think it's planting date that's magical. It's more emergence and when do they canopy and when do they start to flower. So if you plant soybeans April 1st and you plant soybeans May 1st and they come up on the same day, I don't think there'll be much of an advantage to early planting.
Yeah, and I kind of think the May one might actually tad a little better there, because it might be off to the races when she comes out of the ground, which is always a pretty good idea.
So we mentioned the yield contest, some new records this year, a lot higher yields this year than there were last year in the contest. You guys are certainly in the high yield business. Did you happen to set any new yield records in the program this year?
So actually, Lance, our yields are a lot higher than you would expect given the weather that we had. Mm-hmm. I mean, there's something called rain that I used to think helped the crop, but now
maybe it's overrated.
Now I might have to be changing my mind a little bit. I think obviously rain is spotty. But our yields are much higher than we would have expected given the rain we had. And, at our Champaign site and at our Yorkville site, we did see hybrids that were well into the 300s. Mm-hmm. We didn't have a record, but we did have a 343 up in Yorkville, happily, with one of your favorite products. But so the answer is, where did that yield come from? Mm-hmm. What were the management factors that related to yield? And I think that's one of the things that we're interested in. We have our management yield potential trials. We do have that report on our website, and in that report we take a select grouping of commercial hybrids, and we look at how they respond to management, and that gives us a little take on sort of what the season was.
And remind us which aspects of management you guys are testing.
Yeah. So we're looking at the impact of fertility, broadcast fertility, 80 pounds P2O5, 60 pounds K2O, 20 pounds sulfur. We also look at the impact of density, going from 34,000 up at 8,000 to 42,000. We look at with and without foliar protection. So that's fungicide and insecticide. And then we also look at narrow row spacing, the difference between 20-inch rows and 30-inch rows. And if you've heard me in the past, Lance, I'm a big advocate of managing more plants for higher yield. And that managing more plants generally involves changing the row spacing and making sure I fed and protected those plants. Mm-hmm. It isn't rocket science. But we had a year this year where we didn't have a lot of leaf disease, and that changed factors. If you look at a common denominator across the state of Illinois, that was no rain in June.
Right.
I mean, I think every single one of my sites was lucky to have a third of the quote normal rain in June. Yeah, and that's apparently a pretty important parameter when it comes to how weather affects yield.
Until the derecho came through on June 29th, there was a lot of people that were going to set a record for the driest June in history. I was setting at 0.17 of an inch total rain for June, and then that darn derecho came through, gave me 1.5 inches, and screwed my chance to break a record. I always like to think if you're going through hellish weather, you might as well set a record while you're being miserable.
Yeah.
And I could have waited another day to get my saving rain, so I would have got that record. But
That rain helped me too on the last day of June. And the good news for me when it came by my house, Lance, is the winds were a little higher, so took out a good 15 or so trees, but the corn was fine.
Yeah.
So that was the good news.
Yeah. My corn was so stunted and so rubbery and so short and so drought stressed. It took it pretty well.
Well. So we didn't have much rain in July. And you know what happens if you don't have rain in June or much in July? We didn't have much disease. On average, Lance, we had about a 7 or 8 bushel advantage from foliar protection. Positive, but way less than we normally would see. Here's another thing that we learned, and this is not good for the seed business, but if you don't have rain in July or rain in June, then you really can't respond to the higher population.
Right.
This is a year where the higher population didn't hurt us, but it didn't help us either.
Right.
And I blame the fact that we didn't have the rain in June. No population effect this year.
One thing that we've talked about some on the program through the growing season, while height doesn't necessarily relate to yield potential in corn, and we've seen that with short corn, I was a little concerned about leaf area being reduced by the drought during vegetative growth stages. And we did, in some cases, have plants that really cannibalized themselves during grain fill because we had good yield potential, but we probably had a smaller factory to create that potential. I guess speak to that.
Yeah, height doesn't matter, Lance, but guess what? Weight does. I mean, so you can have a small dense plant or that so the weight of the plant makes a big difference. And if we set that yield potential and then we don't have the conditions during grain fill, guess what? It's going to cannibalize it right out of the stock. And there were a few numbers that had bad years and did that pretty bad. It's not that they don't have a high yield. It's just that the stock wasn't able to, the plant wasn't able to support it.
Well, and something that there's a few companies out there that have looked at the ability of plants to reallocate sugar differently than others, and some have been shown to more aggressively cannibalize than others, and how that correlate, how the ability of a plant to produce sugar and move it around to where it needs it can relate to yield is a topic that there is some interest in, and I don't know that that's anything that you've specifically looked at in your work.
We had so you're thinking about how you're allocating your bank account, right? Here's the energy account, and how are we going to allocate it? And is it going to be the stalk, the leaf, the root, the ear? How's it going to go? We have looked at this, Lance, particularly with short corn. I mean, here's a trade-off, right? Let me ask you, Lance, do you pay for roots and yield? I mean, they take energy. Where would that energy go if I wasn't putting it into roots? So I have the perception that you pay for roots and yield, but you still have to have those roots, right? So you got to make just the right investment to have rooting to take up enough water and mineral nutrients. If you put too much into root or too much into stalk, that's at the expense of yield. And so we're always looking at a wicked trade-off between how we're going to allocate our resources. And we want just enough in the stalk to hold it up. We want just enough to the root to get the water and nutrients. And we want most of the energy to be able to go to the ear and grain.
And what Adam and Jennifer and I and others that work with farmers notice is in years where there's no health issues and no stalk issues, they want it all going to yield. And then in years where we have some stalk problems, then they're like, well, you're putting too much into yield, and we need to keep the plant healthier, and it's falling apart, and we need more balance here. So that balancing act between, how much do we hold back for plant health and how much do we give to the ear to make it yield as much as possible is kind of the dilemma that the breeders have to get that just right.
And that trade-off isn't all your fault, of course. You can keep the plant healthy by making sure that it has adequate plant nutrition throughout the season and that you can provide foliar protection. So there are some tools on the grower's end to help with that health. But it's always going to be a trade-off between how you allocate your resources. Here's one thing I do know, Lance, and this is a big area of research, and it kind of goes into this biological realm. As we increase yield, what's going to be the outcome? More residue. Notice how I didn't call residue trash, because that residue has value. There's a lot of nutritional value in that residue. So 43.7 dry pounds of residue per bushel. Right? You can't change that math. Think of how much residue this new world record has.
Right.
I mean, it's like 14 tons.
Yeah.
I mean, I'd like to get my hands on that for that nutritional value. So not only, Lance, are we having higher yield with more residue, but we're seeing a movement towards more strip till. We have cover crops now with climate resiliency. We're going to have double crops here in central Illinois pretty soon. And we actually do, and we have more residue. So a lot of the research we're looking at, and this is in the biological realm, is these biological compounds that help us degrade residue. And they have a lot of cool names like residue busters and stubble this. But the idea here is, can we do something to the residue to change it from trash to treasure? And get that nutritional value. And I think there is some real possibilities here, Lance.
Yeah, and we've had, there's certainly been situations where when you've got a late harvest and an extremely healthy plant, and so that residue is pristine and it gets harvested late, the amount of nutrients that are tied up in that and the amount of negative impact that you can have from that residue
from immobilization
it's very noticeable in some of these years where we have residue challenges. The first field you harvest versus the last field you harvest, and how much time that residue had to break down in the fall makes a big difference, to the impact it has on next year's crop.
Yeah, exactly, Lance. And here we're trying to increase yield, and we're going to have more residue to have to manage. So, I think this is going to be part of the management system.
And while we're on that subject, I think a misconception that some farmers have about short corn is that there'll be less residue because it's shorter. And I like to point out to people that if there's less residue, there's going to be less yield too. So probably, we're going to change the structure of that plant, but we're not necessarily changing the amount of biomass of the plant.
Yeah, but guess what, Lance? It's still 44 pounds of residue per bushel. So that math doesn't change. Now there is math that changes a little bit, and I think this is to the advantage. The part of the residue that's decreased in short corn is the stalk, right? So now I might actually have a slightly higher quality of residue. I mean, I don't have to tell you that leaves degrade a lot faster than stalk does, and if I change my leaf-stalk ratio, I might actually be able to degrade that residue a little faster.
Yeah, and we've seen that as well in this sense, is it's surprisingly good silage. And people think well, it'd be worthless for silage. There's no stalk there.
Yep.
Well, that's the worst part of the silage, and it makes extremely good silage.
That somebody smarter than us figured that out, Lance. But it makes sense when you tell it to me. And it still has the grain too. So I don't think we have to worry about that. I don't have to tell you, one of the advantages of short corn is, I don't worry as much about the ratios because of wind. Wind is a nightmare when it comes to harvesting. And I could make that in-season application a lot easier, without an airplane. And then we were talking about, resource allocation. And here's what I see about short corn. I don't have to tell you that I can't tell the difference right out of the ground.
Right.
I only really can tell it's short when it starts to expand those that stalk. And what we noticed is that energy that would have gone into growing that stalk, where does it go? The air, the leaf, and the root. And so there's actually a little energy redistribution that occurs just at the right time.
Right.
If you're a physiologist, this is the kind of stuff we get excited about, Lance.
And that timing of when it has that extra energy is important.
Yes,
and
exactly.
You talking about the penalty of growing too much root. I remember some of the old research that was done here in the entomology group looking at the ability of hybrids to regenerate roots after rootworm feeding.
Oh yeah.
Which, is in July, and hybrids that had the ability to grow a lot of roots in July don't yield very well.
Who would have thought?
You know, and it makes a lot of sense knowing what we know now. But back then, I think people were kind of surprised by that because they thought growing roots would be a benefit to the plant. But if you're growing roots when you're supposed to be growing kernels, it's not a benefit to the plant.
Yeah. I'm going to blame a former advertising campaign that somebody ran. I can't remember who it was, but it had something to big roots, big yield.
Mm-hmm.
That may not be correct.
Well, strong roots, strong yield.
Yeah.
Oh, strong.
Yeah.
Strong, not big.
Yeah.
Strong is better than big.
Yeah. Well, and
That's in the fact checking.
and I have, you know, I have asked growers before when they want really good root ratings, you know, how much they're getting paid for roots on the Board of Trade. So roots is not what we're growing, but to your point, you got to have enough root to get the nutrient. And your research has shown that as you push population, roots get smaller.
Yes,
which changes how you need to feed the plant.
Ultimately. So here's one thing that we've discovered. We have students working on roots. There is shocking variation among commercial hybrids in their rooting structure.
Yeah.
All right. Both in their depth, their density, their arrangement, their angle.
And,
Shocking.
And their mass too,
And their
right?
mass.
Yeah.
Now, being scientists, we like to think that must mean something, and maybe we could take advantage of that to enhance the management. Now, one thing we do know, as we increase the population of plants, each plant has a smaller root system.
Mm-hmm.
And it doesn't matter what the size of the root system is to begin with.
Mm-hmm.
For every 1,000 plant increase, plant per acre population, you lose 2.5% of the weight of each root weight.
Mm-hmm.
So it goes down.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, much as you may or may not like it, plant population is going to have to continue to increase to grow higher yield. And that means we're going to have less below ground roots.
Does the row spacing impact the angle of that decline?
It does.
Okay.
Yes, good question. Good question, Lance. So as you go to a narrow row spacing, each individual plant's root system gets 20 to 25% larger. So it still declines in a narrow row,
Mm-hmm.
but at the same density, it's like capturing the root size of 6,000 plants.
Mm-hmm.
So as I go to a narrow row, I capture that 6,000 plant density. You know, I learned about narrow rows when I was in school, that they only work in the northern latitudes, you know, north of I-90, where it's a short day or a long day in a short season. Wouldn't work in the southern latitudes. But I think a lot of growers in our research is showing they actually do work in the southern latitudes. And I think the reason is because each plant has a larger root system, better spacing. That's because of better light distribution within the canopy. And that allows those plants then to mine the soil for nutrients and water, even in areas that have a longer season.
Mm-hmm. Excellent. So any questions come in yet, Adam, on the
Not
chat?
yet. We've been
Okay.
quiet on the
All right.
questions.
Everybody's quiet this morning. So
I think when it comes to, you guys are talking about row architecture and light interception and the root's capability to intercept more water and nutrients, take it up to produce all the wonderful goodness and sugars that we like to translate to yield. That's where short corn, I mean, you combine all these things, row spacing and short corn, you're doing a lot of work with placement of nutrients and things like that. That's where you start to create the synergies, and the light interception that short corn, I think, is going to allow into the canopy. Tell me what you think about how much difference that makes. Is getting light interception deeper into the canopy an advantage, a disadvantage, or how we typically capture most of the light at the top of the canopy? Is that making any difference in what yield potential we might or might not have?
Yeah. So, hey, here's a chance where I get to talk physiology. And then the question is, does it help to distribute light within the canopy? And the answer is absolutely. And you may remember this from your plant physiology days, Adam. Light use per unit photon is greatest at low levels. And so that means I can sacrifice a little photosynthesis at the top of the plant. But if I can distribute that light into the lower canopy, then the net canopy photosynthesis is substantially higher. You know, when I look at short corn, you know, it's made for density or made for narrow rows, at least the phenotypes that I've looked at. I mean, it tends to hold its leaf up a little higher. The architecture, I don't know what it is about shortening the stature that makes the light distribute better, but it really seems to do it into the lower canopy. Put it in a narrow row and it's even a better effect is what we have noticed. So pretty excited about it, both the in-season application and potential yield. And I don't think you have your best germplasm in short corn yet. So I think the possibilities that are yet to come are pretty impressive.
One thing we saw this year, we talked a lot about how dry it was in May and June, record dryness at that time. Root growth and development was negatively impacted, in my opinion, by being so dry. It was hard to grow roots.
Yeah, especially when you plant it.
Yeah,
if you could follow the water down.
Yeah, huge perception out there that corn grows better roots in dry weather. And this year we got so dry that that was certainly not the case. But did see related to that huge differences in banded versus broadcast fertility, starter row effect. I mean, having nutrition closer to the root, easier for the root to get to, created some huge visual differences this year. I don't know how much that translated to yield necessarily, but I guess you've done a lot of work with banding. I know you really think banding is the way of the future when it comes to nutrition, and I guess speak to that a little bit.
Yeah, I do. So, think about how we typically fertilize, right? We're fertilizing the whole soil. And we're using the sort of the build-up maintenance approach on a soil test. Fertilize the whole soil. Now, I don't have to tell you guys that, the root doesn't sit in all of the soil. Mm-hmm. It only sits in a third. Root volume only expands maybe 8 inches horizontally at best. Fertilizers are pretty expensive. I told you as we increase the density, the root size goes down. Pretty sure nutrients enter the plant through the root. Mm-hmm. All right, I'm a big advocate of the 4 R's, and one of those is the right place, right. And at the right time too, and that's going to be where those roots are. Actually, it was Mr. Henniger who got me into the fertilizer placement business. I think he placed it. I think it was 2009. I couldn't believe it, out of the ground, in effect. Now. Usually, if I'm bigger out of the ground, it helps. Not always. Mm-hmm. Usually. Mm-hmm. Sometimes, bigger than I am, the harder I fall, particularly if I get hit with hail or drought. But usually, getting out of the ground faster is better, and we see this with starter and with placed fertilizer. I'm a huge proponent of banding now with RTK. We know right where that fertilizer is. Mm-hmm. Strip till, I think, is making an increase because of the ability to employ both conservation tillage and place the nutrients. Mm-hmm. So we didn't do any banding work this year, Lance. I'm happy to say we got a new strip till rig. Okay. We've actually retrofitted a Soil Warrior, and that Soil Warrior, we have these trials out now. We have a coulter setup where we can stratify some of the nutrients in the seed furrow. We actually have a shank setup where we can apply the nutrients in 2 ways. One of them is a tillage depth where we stratify, and the other one places it all 7 inches deep to get an idea of the placement. We've done this in the fall. We'll do it in the spring. We'll compare it to conventional. We'll compare it to no-till. So I don't know what system's best, but I'm pretty sure placing the nutrients is going to have a big impact in the future. And Lance, it comes down to making sure those nutrients are available at the time of peak uptake. Right. We've looked at nutrient uptake curves. You can see the seasonal uptake over the course of the season. Well, one of my students, smarter than I, figured out that I could take that curve, and with calculus, I could calculate the rate of change. Apparently, that's what you use calculus for, Lance. And
it's good to know.
I knew that in high school, but so we calculated for all the nutrients the rate of change, and what it really shows is that each nutrient has a different period of peak uptake, and that's the time that you have to make sure the nutrition is available. Early on, it doesn't matter. Later, it doesn't matter, but peak uptake of corn, that's like V8 to R2. And yield is 100% related to peak uptake. Mm-hmm. Can't increase yield without increasing the peak uptake. That's going to take placement. going to have to place those nutrients to achieve those high yields. And so, yes, we're really excited about it. I know it takes effort. I know it takes work.
Yeah.
But nothing worthwhile is easy.
And that's one of the trade-offs. We do so many things for convenience and timeliness and ability to get across acres, and a lot of these high yield practices, they do take extra time. They slow us down. They require specialized equipment. I know my retail supplier that I work with, they actually have a strip till machine that can apply dry fertilizer while they're putting on anhydrous, but they don't get across the acres with that. There's more maintenance. It costs about twice as much as a normal anhydrous toolbar, and sometimes growers are hesitant to want to pay the amount of money that it costs to do that application, and they can get across a lot more acres spreading fertilizer with a truck and putting on anhydrous with a standard toolbar. And so that that tug of war between how's it easiest to get the work done versus what's the best way to do it, and how much benefit is there to taking the additional time to do it a more difficult way.
Yeah. Convenience is that's the bane of our existence, Lance. Something it's called fast food, but the growers are the benefactors. I don't know what to tell them, what to try, and here's what I do know: the yields this year were a lot better than we expected, and a lot of the management factors that usually made a big impact, things like density and foliar protection, didn't have as big an impact as usual. Right. That meant the genetics pulled the day. I mean, I don't have to tell you the most important decision that a grower makes is genetics. And we see a 50, 60 bushel swing, and when we can produce 300 plus bushels with the precipitation we had, and not responding to other key protection or management factors, that shows you the yield potential of today's genetics. I'm pretty excited about being able to get a so-called normal year again one day to look at some of this genetics.
I'm starting to wonder what normal means anymore, actually. I say that every year.
Yeah, I think it means taking variable weather and averaging it.
Yeah.
But,
Just a little bit of rain all throughout the season.
I like to point out to my environmentalist friends that abnormal weather is not a new thing. There's always been extremes, and I do like to point out, I love the fact that genetics enabled us to get through a tough weather year this year. But I do think it's fair to point out that we did get pretty good amounts of rain in a lot of areas in July and August.
That's what helped us.
It was May and June that was desperately dry, and the plant's not doing anything terribly difficult in May and June compared to what it has to do in July and August. And had we had ample rainfall in May and June and none in July and August, we would not have achieved.
Could have been a bigger crash.
Yeah.
We may that may have been a disaster. I agree.
Because if you look back at some of the famous drought years in history, 83, 88, 12, we had like half an inch of rain in July those years, and that's what really destroyed the yield potential in those years.
Yeah, I actually don't mind if it's a little dry in April and May, Lance. It allows me to get out there and get the crop in at my timely manner and without mudding it in.
Yeah.
Guys, we got some great questions.
Oh, good.
Cool.
Excellent.
Good.
We're almost done.
Good. Yeah.
Start with Tom's question. So feeding off some of your fertilizer or placement and banding and starter, he's got a question about starter, and maybe you could compare and contrast starter versus banding and placement of fertilizer. But Tom's question is, why doesn't that starter effect always translate to better yields? If corn doesn't want a bad day, it seems like early better growth should always translate to better yield.
Yeah, excellent question, Tom. I'm gonna answer that one first, and I'll let Lance eviscerate my answer. So Tom, I'm gonna make a generalization, and I'm gonna say that this is true of everything. If I get the crop out of the ground faster, most of the time that's going to give me an increase in yield. So if I see an effect out of the ground 5 times out of 10, it's going to give me an increase in yield, a notable increase in yield. So half the time. Out of the other half the time, 3 of those times, it'll trend in the right direction. 1 time, it won't do anything. and 1 or 2 times it'll be negative. And you'll say, how did that happen? And that's because, Tom, the bigger you are, the harder you fall. If you're bigger out of the ground and you get dry, now you may have a bigger liability if you get hit by a hailstorm, if you're more susceptible to disease. Getting the crop off to a fast start is generally a good sign, but you got to often finish it up in the back end, and many things limit and affect yield. And so that's my suspicion. The starter always. Do I usually see it? Yes. Does it always give me a yield increase? Usually, but not always.
Yeah. Your analogy of the bigger you are, the harder you fall. I actually saw that in the derecho this year. I had a very progressive, very good farmer use a starter. Noticed at harvest time, his corn died earlier than most of his neighbors, yielded less than most of his neighbors, and they were extremely frustrated that they were not seeing the better yields that they typically see. Well, he had the biggest, greenest, lushest, leafiest corn when the derecho hit, and he had the flattest corn the next morning after the derecho. And so there are, she's adjusting. Okay. So there are situations where that additional vegetative growth early can hurt you. And I think the conversation we were having about how important July and August is to the yield of corn is part of the factor too. So if things that happen early were vitally important to corn, we would have had a pretty crappy corn crop this year because it got off to a horribly awful start and still yielded well. So I think there's lots of reasons why we don't always see that benefit to starter. And what I see is people that like to do it ignore those times when it doesn't benefit. People that don't want to do it, they latch on to those. It's like, see, that's not worth doing. What a pain in the butt that is.
It's like fungicide, right? Fungicide.
Right. Yep.
Yeah, but great question, Tom.
We're used to that with Tom. He's always got great questions.
Yeah,
so
great question, Tom. So got a couple other questions coming in related to fertility. One of them, Merle Bettle, good old Merle, he's chiming in this morning with a great question. And so 2023 is a relatively dry year. Obviously, we talked about not making quite as much biomass. The leaf size a little smaller this year. So his question is because of slightly less residue potentially due to the dry weather conditions, should he consider adjusting his fertilizer plans because of that?
So I'm going to say he knows the yield, right? And based on yield, we could calculate. You could estimate removal. All right. And the first thing I want to see a grower do is know what they removed and say at some point, and unless I had too much, I'm going to have to replace what was removed. Yep. Remember, I said that there's 43.7 pounds of residue per bushel. That doesn't change. Right. So you could take, if it has high bushels and he still has the residue, whether it looks like it or not.
Right.
Linear relationship. No
Absolutely.
Right.
Yep.
Yeah. So I would say there might be, if there is in fact less residue there, there could be a little bit less tied up in that residue. That residue may break down a little quicker. It may recycle a little faster, but based on your yield, you still remove the same amount of nutrition based on whatever yield you produce. So I wouldn't worry about, how much residue's there as much as I worry about how much yield did I remove and make sure you're putting that back.
If you had a low yield year, then maybe save some of the nutrients in the soil.
Yeah, it's hard to save your way to prosperity, but you do need less fertilizer if you produce less yield.
So you guys are doing a lot of work in the crop physiology lab with placement of fertility, and you talk about right timing. John's got a question. I want to know more about your operation, what you guys are doing in the crop physiology lab about in-season fertilizer applications and some of your high yield work. Looks like he's wanting to know a little bit more of maybe potentially about some late nitrogen applications potentially as well. So if you could address kind of what you're looking at as far as timings and if you're doing anything a little later related to nitrogen, I think that helps John.
Yeah, John. So we know that some nutrients are actually acquired during flowering. I mean, half of the phosphorus and half the sulfur that corn takes up or absorbed after flowering. A quarter of the nitrogen is absorbed after flowering. So we're doing the classic Y drop, right? We got Y drop, liquid Y drop, where we can come in season. We've not run that rig much after V8 because we do plant damage. With short corn we played around late because we can get in. I'm contractually bound to not be able to tell you what we learned, but we do want to have in-season nutrition. We know now the main way to put it along the root is Y drop. We know Y drop involves liquid. We know liquid, all nutrients don't like to play nice in a liquid, and sometimes liquid is a little pricey. So one of the things we're looking at with some success is what we call dry drop. One of our former PhD students invented this name, and it's simply putting dry fertilizer along the row and then allowing the precipitation. We have had that in the past, not recently, but if we put the dry fertilizer along the row, we let the corn plant funnel the water down the row, and then it distributes that nutrient right along the row. All right, so dry drop would allow us to use multiple nutrients, presumably cocktails of different sources that are going to release at different rates. Stay tuned, we're just getting started, but there does appear to be some promise. John, then we're going to put the dry on, V7, V8, where we could still get in there, and if we want it to release late, we'll use slow coatings or something like this.
Well, and I like to remind people too that to have nutrients available late doesn't necessarily require you to apply them late. And sometimes when you apply late, they're not available in time to benefit the plant.
Absolutely, unless you have water in proximity.
Right. So just because we can put it on late doesn't necessarily mean the plant's going to benefit more from that. You have to have it be available to the plant when it's looking for it. I see we've had several Pivot Bio related questions coming in, and I know that's another product you've worked with a lot. So let's spend a little bit of time with your experience with that product.
Okay. Yeah. So Pivot Bio's product, Proven 40, and I think that stands for 40 pounds of N. So we have looked at that product. It actually is supplying some N to the plant at a time that the plant needs it, and it is coming from the air. I'm going to say 25 pounds in our research, but it's variable. Now here's the key question. The way I like to look at it. Does this mean that I reduce my nitrogen rate over my whole field? Think about where the corn plant gets its nitrogen from. It gets it from the soil and the fertilizer in roughly equal proportions. So roughly half the N comes from the soil, half the N comes from the fertilizer. Now, I don't have to tell every grower that there's a part of every field you have where either the soil lets you down, it doesn't supply its half, or the fertilizer lets you down, it doesn't supply its half, and you have a decrease in yield. All right, in those areas, it'd sure be nice to have a third source, the air, to fill those gaps. And that's what Proven 40 does. It's a third source. I don't want to think about it as insurance, but it's sure going to control field spatial variation because in those areas where the N is lost, a little goes a long way. Now, in order to demonstrate the product's effective, you have to lower the N rate to be able to show that it works in research. Now think about what happened in 2023. This is what happened in our research. We didn't have any rain in May. We didn't have any rain in June. We didn't have an all nitrogen loss. In fact, we didn't see much nitrogen deficiency. Did see a lot of potassium deficiency though. Apparently, if you don't have rain in June, you don't get potassium to the plant. So no nitrogen deficiency per se, but we did have a lot of potassium deficiency. And I don't have to tell you that potassium and nitrogen sort of go hand in hand in the plant. Now, if I have another source and I don't have a lot of rain, I don't have a lot of nitrogen deficiency or a lot of nitrogen loss, I didn't need much nitrogen this year. Across the state in our trials, the top N rate was 150 pounds of N. 150 pounds of N in the north, 150 pounds in the south. With no nitrogen at all, we produced 110 bushels in the south and 150 in the north. That's what the soil supplied.
Mm-hmm.
So it wasn't a good year to show that I needed extra N from the air. That's what we saw in our research. Doesn't mean the product's not doing what it's supposed to do, but something else limited the yield.
With the spatial variability that you talk about,
Killer.
with some parts of the field, you're going to see less or more of a benefit. How difficult does that make it to generate data to prove that something's working?
So here's what happens in response to N. It changes every 30 foot. So every 30 foot, the response to N changes. That's called a variogram in statistical terms. And that means when we're going to evaluate an N-fixing product, we have to have our treatment and our control within 30 foot of each other to account for field spatial variation. And so that makes a lot of controls, makes for big trials. But that's the only way that you can do it. When it comes to a product like Pivot, and this is true of many biologicals, they're going to work better length of the field than they are in or full field than they are in small plot research, because you're going to cross multiple management zones and help control some of the field spatial that we struggle with.
Mm-hmm. And this is actually a question that we had a good question from Tom earlier. One of Tom's landlords asked me this question one time, was how in the world, as a farmer, do you decide what biological products you're going to play with? and I know you've done, as much research with biologicals as anybody I know, but you haven't tested them all either. I've heard Connor talk about the 3 different categories of biological products, and I'd like you to speak to that a little bit. But what coaching do you have for farmers if they want to do something with biologicals? Where do you start? How do you decide what you want to do?
Yeah, excellent question. And Connor's an expert on this. And what he did is he put these products into categories to say, this is what the product mostly does. And then we asked the grower, first question I'm going to ask the grower, if they're telling me they're using a biological, do they actually know what it does? I mean, what category is it does? What is it supposed to do? And then the next question is, do they actually need that done?
That's a good question.
Yeah.
So when we just say biological, what do they do? And the first thing Dr. Sybil did is he divided them into the living and the dead.
Mm-hmm.
Right, the living are they're the microbes, the fungi, the mycorrhiza. They're alive. The dead are either they used to be alive, or they're extracts or the biostimulants. Now, if I'm a living product, you got to keep me alive before you use it.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And that often requires refrigeration and special handling and not leaving me in the tank, if it rains for a few weeks. So there's a challenge to make sure that the living ones are actually delivered alive. Mm-hmm. And research, we pay very, very close attention to these. So let's think about the living ones. There's the nitrogen-fixing bacteria. And there's many examples of these, proven bio, azotic, nutritia. These are N-fixing bacteria. What do they do? Supply N. If you don't need more N, probably aren't going to benefit.
Mm-hmm.
Phosphorus solubilizing bacteria. What do they do? Solubilize phosphorus. Where might they work? High levels of soil of phosphorus. Mm-hmm. Mycorrhizal fungi. Extend the root system, help the plant acquire immeasurable nutrients like phosphorus and potassium. A lot of tillage, probably not going to work. Cut up the mycelia fungi. If you say to me, I want to use a mycorrhizal fungi, the first thing I'm going to ask you, are you doing tillage? The next class is the residue digesters, mixture of compounds that you put on residue to help degrade and digest it. These include fungi and bacteria. Then you go into the non-living. They actually have enzymes, phosphatate enzymes that make organic pee available. Where do you think these might work? Manured ground, where you got a lot of organic pee. There's the humic and fulvic acid market. These things have been on the market for a long time. They're chelators, so they chelate cations. They're also food sources for microorganisms. There's the alginates, algae products. Depending on where the algae grows, you can make a biostimulant about it. Sometimes they upregulate processes that presumably stress. Sometimes they release nutrients. They're food sources. And then the simple ones is the sugars. Mm-hmm. Sugars like, I did a coffee shot this morning to wake myself up. Like an espresso shot for the microbes.
I think it worked.
That are already there. I got it in the background. So think about when you plant, think about where microbes live, right? In association with the plant. They live in the root. I plant the seed, there is no root. What if I could put a sugar there to make the microbe think that there's a root there, and they get going, and here comes the root, and we're off to the races. The key question is, what are you trying to do, right? And that's the first step along the way. What is it I need done? Do I have too much organic phosphorus? I'm going to use this. Do I want to jumpstart my microbes? I'm going to use that. But they're not all the same.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Great.
So hopefully that's a reasonable education. They're here to stay. We're researching them. We have both our soybean and corn biological studies on our website, or will be soon, where we try to do an unbiased screen and show the results. Interestingly enough, not all companies let us do that.
Yeah, excellent conversation on the biologicals. It's a really, really interesting space right now with a lot of questions, a lot of interest. Coming back to the fertilizer side of things a little bit, and one particular nutrient Mike Raby's got a question about. He's asking about zinc, and he's kind of asking a little bit about where and when and how zinc placement is important. So he's curious in particular, zinc and liquid starter versus the new up and coming seed treatments containing zinc. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I looked a little bit of both. You could overdo the zinc in furrow. I've noticed as well. So I'm gonna tell you to be a little careful. Don't go too high.
Is that a toxicity issue, or do you know?
I don't know what happens. I think it's a toxicity issue. I put a compound on my roof to control algae. I'm pretty sure it was zinc. So I haven't compared them. I don't know the answer to that. And Lance, do you know?
Well, I mean, one of the things that, and I've certainly seen benefits to zinc in all ways. I've seen benefits in starter. I've seen benefits on seed treatments. I've seen benefits in furrow. I've seen benefits broadcast. Jennifer keeps trying to keep me in the picture. I'm trying to keep Dr. Bilo in the picture. So anyway, one thing that I kind of challenge people to think about a little bit is how much of a nutrient is required, and how much can you deliver, as a seed treatment versus in a row starter versus in dry fertilizer, how you want to do that. There's certainly multiple ways to deliver things, but if a plant needs, say, half a pound of a nutrient, and you're delivering 1/100 of a pound of a nutrient, not that there might not be a benefit to that, but you're not delivering a very high percentage of what the plant actually needs, in that manner. So there's probably situations where you might want to apply things, multiple ways, and maybe there's a benefit as a seed treatment, but you may still need other sources to go along with the seed treatment, depending on how much you're able to deliver that way.
Yeah, so I'll chime in again, Lance. That there's actually a fairly substantial post-flowering uptake of zinc by corn plants, and the way that we've supplied it, and I like what Lance said. Maybe multiple times, a little at a way. Very often in the soil test, zinc is deficient, less than a part per million. We've used co-granulated fertilizers that contain zinc, and this allows us to get the spread pattern. Probably 2.5 pounds applied, probably more than you need. But we know that we get a distribution pattern. And the nice thing about zinc applied as part of a co-granulated fertilizer, if a root gets there, it's got more than one nutrient, and then you could claim the term balanced crop nutrition somehow.
Yeah. Zinc definitely has a pretty interesting pattern where its uptake is all throughout the growing season for sure, and something to think about with that availability. Mike's got another question about liquid starters in particular. He says, how much of a starter's nutrients will we eventually be able to attach to the seed and not harm the seed or seedling? So maybe we could expand beyond zinc and think about some other products, some other nutrients. The space on the seed coating,
limited real estate.
I was gonna say it's getting pretty tight around that seed coating with the treatment space between all the fungicides, insecticides, and some of the different products to control SDS. What do you guys think the future is, or the opportunity is there to continue to invest in that seed treatment versus a starter application?
So I'll chime in first. Well, I'll let Lance correct me then. I mean, as Adam pointed out, seed treatment is limited real estate. And I actually think the first thing should be on the seed prioritized is the protectant. All right, that's proven. So protection first, and that's protection from things which are going to attack the seed or the young seedling. Everything else has got to be secondary in my mind to the protection. Because think of the environment that we're putting that seed in, right? It's kind of vulnerable. I recognize, from a marketing sense, the value of seed treatment versus in furrow, because if I can put my juice on the seed, I could potentially touch it, every acre. It's easy. It's in the bag. I got to have the in furrow set up, and it actually has to be working, and I got to haul the liquid out there. So it's a lot more work to do in furrow. If you ask me the difference from a nutrition standpoint, let's say you got a nutrition standpoint between the seed and in furrow, I would tell you in furrow is treating the seedling. Mm-hmm. And the seedling is what you want to treat. Mm-hmm. I don't care about seed coat when it comes to the growing seedling. So usually when it's nutritionals, in my mind, treating the seedling is going to be more effective than treating the seed.
Right. Yeah, and I think from a practical seed industry standpoint, we have to worry about compatibility of what's going on in the seed. We have to worry about the impact of the germ of the seed. We have to worry about the long-term impact of the quality of the seed. And so there's certain real limitations with what, a seed company can put on a seed. And if you're talking about downstream treating, that opens up another can of worms as far as, what's the impact of the quality, what's the impact of your ability to return that seed if you're not able to plant it the way you thought you would. So there are some pitfalls with getting nutritionals on seed that you don't have to deal with if you're doing it in furrow. And you can get so much more applied in furrow, more products, more mixtures, more amounts, more pounds, more volume. I get it. It's always a challenge to keep a starter system going on a planter. They plug, they break down, they have issues. I've fought that on my own farm. I was at one time a devoted starter fertilizer user. And after fighting it for a couple years, I was never happier than when the planter that had starter on it went away. And we went to one that didn't have starter. And then after a few years of not having starter and going to Dr. Belo's meetings and listening to him talk and knowing the potential benefits, now I'm starting to feel like a crappy farmer because I don't have starter on my planter. So I'm probably going to put it back on, and then I'll start that cycle all over again.
It's a 20-year rule.
Yeah. Oh, that's great. Well, maybe you need to think about banding next, Lance. Maybe
we do strip till where we can. So yeah, I like the strip. I've always been a no-till guy, always been a minimum till guy. Love the banded fertility in the strip. Just hard to get it all done sometimes.
Well, hey, we're running up here on 8:30, and Dr. Bilo is a busy guy with a lot of stuff to do. So Lori had one last question that actually is a great transition for us to try and start to wrap up our conversation. She wants to know, Dr. Bilo, how do you decide what trials you're going to work on next year?
Excellent question. So part of it comes from these little discussions, right? I listen to what the questions people ask me are, and there's common questions. So part of it is, I'm a spy, and I want to know what are the key questions. The real thing though is our research is done as part of graduate student training. I mean, Adam and Lance know this. So what we try to do is we try to recruit grad students with cool new things to look at. And then we try and get somebody like Bayer to pay for it.
I was going to ask if somebody's throwing huge piles of cash at you, does that have an impact on what you want to test?
There are contributions that help. Laurie, it's largely about what we think needs to be looked at. What are the key things? We try and be ahead of the game. In research, you want us to look down the road. We put a huge investment into looking at narrow rows, which most people hate because it's a big equipment investment. But you want us to be looking at that 10 or 15 years before you buy it. And that's what we're doing. We're looking at biologicals, trying to hash out where and how to use them, right? Is there any truth to this stuff? Most of it's garbage, but some of it works. And you want us to know where and how to do it. You want us to look at things like short corn, in addition to Bayer, right? Because we get more false respect than them, and therefore we can fact check each other. I'll tell you some things that I didn't talk to you about that we are working on that you're gonna like, and then we'll quit. And this will be on our website soon. Connor Sybil is great with Twitter. Apparently that's social media. I'm too old for that. But
it's X now, not Twitter anymore. Remember,
we have a fantastic study on can we correct flooding with nitrogen application. This is a huge question we get. We used our irrigation system to purposefully flood, which was a real challenge this year. I got to tell you,
farmers do love to fix things with nitrogen.
Right. So the question is, at what stage and what damage of flooding can I correct with nitrogen? Stay tuned for that. There's some way you can, some way you can't. The other question I get the most, and we have a huge study. I wish I had the answer today, but I don't want to spoil Dr. Sybil's ultimate tweet. Is there such a thing as phantom yield loss? Every U.S. farmer that I talk to believes in phantom yield loss. And every one of you has a question where you left the field, came back, and lost 20 bushels from phantom yield loss. By the way, nowhere else in the world have they heard of phantom yield loss, but the U.S. farmers are all about it. They all believe it. And then the question is it yield loss on the plant or is it a combine setting? And we have a pretty decent trial to try and answer that question. Stay tuned for the answer. I'll tell you what happened the first time. We were sure it was black layered. Man, we looked at the black layer, looked at the milk line, went from the first date to the second date. We actually increased yield. So we had reverse phantom yield loss.
I have seen that happen when you rush things a little bit. It does yield more if you let it quit growing.
Apparently. So nobody complains about reverse phantom yield loss. It's the other way around. Stay tuned. We have it in storage now. We'll have the answer to this.
I'll give my prediction, and you can maybe next year you can tell me if I'm right. I do think phantom yield loss is real, but it's much smaller than people perceive it to be.
Is it on the combine or is it on the plant?
I think there is kernel respiration that occurs that decreases yield, but I think most of it's physical loss that you don't account for.
And that's mostly other brands, right, that have that problem.
Depends on who you ask.
That's good. He's probably right. Let's use a typical agronomical term. It's conditional on the hybrid and the weather and combine setting, which is probably the way it's going to be. But hey, I really appreciate your listening and really like the fact that I could wrap this one up and I got to be an agronomist for a little over an hour.
Well, and I would also like to compliment Dr. Bilo. He mentioned as he was answering that question that what they're really doing is training students here. And you've had how many students through your program over the years?
Hundreds. I think 20-something, 25 PhDs.
Yeah, that's amazing. And those people have gone out, been very successful in industry. Some of them work for Bayer. I think there's probably every agricultural company out there that maybe has a former student of Dr. Bilo. And so he always puts his students first, always gives his students great opportunities to learn and share information. And this is actually somewhat rare that Dr. Belo's talking
Well,
about.
I might do, yeah. They
Yeah.
must be busy, or I'd be
Yeah.
sticking one of them with this. They weren't in finals.
So that, big part of what he does in his program is develop young minds and does a fabulous job of that. So with that, we have a prize to give out, I think,
Ooh,
right,
yeah.
Jennifer? So that's one of our other traditions here on the year end. This is our final episode of year 3. So this is a.
Do I get to pick the prize?
Yeah, I Jennifer's going to let you draw a name out. So these names got into this bowl by asking questions throughout the season. And Jennifer actually takes the time to go back through all of the all the episodes to every question you asked. So if you asked 15 questions, your name went in the bowl 15 times.
It's loaded. There's so many names in there.
Yeah. So go ahead and see who's
I won't-
and what we're winning it's a Milwaukee grease gun, which those are awesome.
Mike.
Yeah. So Mike actually asked some questions today.
Way to go, Mike.
So Mike Raby.
Knowledge is power, Mike.
Is our winner, and those Milwaukee grease guns are really nice. My son has one, and they're pretty sweet. So congratulations to Mike. Thank you for all of our loyal followers. I have a ton of fun doing this. We're going to go into season 4 next year already. So after the first of the year, we'll kick things off again. We're gonna keep this rolling. Still waiting for that first royalty check to come in, but having lots of fun. So thanks everybody. Thank you, Dr. Belo.
Yeah, my pleasure. I hope I'm not setting a precedent here.
So we'll everybody have a great holiday. Merry Christmas, and we'll see you again after the first of the year. Take care. All right.
Takes some